Ian Curtis's The Falklands play was commissioned to be screened in 1987. So why has it taken 15 years to get to the screen? With frank and often contradictory contributions from all involved, The Falklands play Row tells us the inside story.
Obviously no swear words, please, but, respond. We want to really make this is the...
Final instructions are given to the backbench MPs and last-minute finishing touches are made as the cameras prepare to roll on The Falklands play.
Set. And action.
For the first time for many years, British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power.
The recording seems to be going to schedule, but in fact this drama is 15 years late. It was originally written for the 5th anniversary of the Falklands War, but it's only now, on the 20th anniversary, that it's finally got the green light.
The government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as preparations are made.
Up until the mid-80s, the play's author, Ian Curtis, had been one of Britain's most highly regarded television playwrights, specialising in political drama. The Falklands play should have been his next big work, but it was suddenly pulled by the BBC. The cancellation caused a media frenzy. The BBC stood accused of banning a pro-Thatcher drama, of political censorship and leftist bias.
We've heard the author tell us it was because he was unwilling to introduce fictional matter critical of the government into his play as a condition of its screening. We still await a plausible explanation of that affair.
So what really happened behind the scenes at the BBC? Was the play dumped because it wasn't up to scratch, as the BBC claimed? Or was it banned for political reasons? The story of the play began in 1982, at the end of the Falklands War. A triumphant Margaret Thatcher had identified a new target, the BBC. Relations were at a low ebb, and she was particularly angry at the way the BBC had reported the war.
The BBC adopted an equivalence of blame or an equivalence of morality between the invader and Britain. I think Mrs. Thatcher felt that the BBC was arrogant and really thinking that it had been appointed and ordained by God to provide the nation with whatever they thought the nation should have.
What happens next, Mr. Nunn? Thank you very much.
Just rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
It was in this highly charged atmosphere of bad feeling between BBC and government that the first seeds of the Falklands play were planted.
It was originally commissioned by the Director General, Alistair Milne, following a play of mine about the Suez crisis.
I went to a Writers' Guild lunch to talk to them about writing, and he was there. And I had greatly admired a couple of plays done for us earlier, Suez and the Churchill and the Generals.
Roughshod over Wavell and the entire command, sending his troops to Greece to disaster, against every advice and opinion expressed. But what's that?
Draft of my speech in defence against the motion.
I knew he was very good at constructing these rather complicated sequences, with battles and discussions about battles and so on. And I said to him, with the Falklands War just having ended, what about doing a play about the Falklands? And he said, yeah, okay, I'll think about that.
Only I can win this war. Only I.
Curtis had never hidden his political views. His plays tended to be celebratory of firm government. This new work was expected to be pro-Thatcher.
It was essentially the case for the defence. The BBC had been heavily criticised, possibly with some justice, at the way they had reported one side of the war, what it was actually going on, but not attempted to explain why it was being fought. At any rate, not enough for people to remember why it was being fought. And so my play was intended to cover that side of it.
One day, the Falklands play landed on my desk, and I read it, and I thought, and wrote to him saying so that it was a thumping good yarn.
He was enthusiastic about it. I also delivered it to the then head of plays, and it was put into immediate production. Studios were booked, budget was allocated and signed, so the whole show was on the road for BBC One at prime time. And then complications suddenly appeared, as it were, stage right.
Enter two key BBC executives, the Managing Director of Television, Bill Cotton, and the new Director of Programmes, Michael Grade. Strong personalities, they didn't share their Director General's enthusiasm.
I sent it down to the television centre, where it ran into rather more flack. Bill Cotton thought it was one-dimensional, and Michael Grade, who was their Director of Programmes, didn't like it at all. So, as you might say, there was a professional disagreement between the three of us.
I was very disappointed because I was quite an admirer of Ian's work, Churchill and the Generals and so on, very much to my taste. That kind of drama adds to the mix of general fiction that one sees on TV. I read it and I thought it was a very poor piece of work. It was the goon show characters in the Argentine, which was silly. He obviously had quite good access, I suspect, to the UK side of things, but basically he had to imagine, I think, what went on the Argentinian side, and that was where the thing really fell apart, and his characterizations were thin, to say the least. The script needed, was many drafts away from being producible.
The task of turning it into a successful production fell to the then head of plays, Peter Goodchild.
It wasn't my cup of tea, if you like. It was something which had been handed to me, but I was going to make absolutely certain that that was as good as I could possibly get it.
Peter is the first, or was the first, appointed to that role who had never had anything to do with plays before. He came from the science side, where he'd done some very good dramatizations of scientific subjects, but that is a million light years from a play.
It's perfectly true. I'd made an extraordinary jump from being head of science to being head of plays, but in science and in special features and so on, we'd won our fair share of BAFTAs, and they were drama BAFTAs.
Goodchild had arranged to meet Curtis to talk through the script. What should have been a routine meeting between the head of plays and the playwright turned out to be the start of a row that would lead the BBC into a major controversy.
It was a very pleasant day. He lived in a lovely house, and we talked. But without a doubt, there was a degree of tension in the air.
The two men now have very different recollections of the meeting.
When he came to see me, he started to propose some changes to the script, which were pretty radical. He wanted me to take out anything to do with what I've described as Margaret Thatcher's private character, her writing in her own hand to the relatives of the servicemen who were killed, any sign of emotion, and particularly signs of her crying, anything of the private Margaret Thatcher. The bellicose iron battle axe, that was all right, that was in, and that is how two previous dramatizations on ITV had shown her. But the private side, the vulnerable side, the human side, that was to be cut out. I was pretty unhappy about that, as you can imagine.
Goodchild denies he had a specific problem with showing the private side of Margaret Thatcher. According to him, he was merely raising points in the script which needed reworking.
Basically, what we talked about as far as Maggie Thatcher was concerned was the question of whether you could actually, orchestrate the changes of mood sufficiently to give the character a kind of sense of a throughput through the piece. And that was really what worried me. I mean, there is the question of, you've got to watch when you're doing a piece like that. She had enough enemies in the world to mean that you somebody was going to pick on you if it seemed as if you produced a kind of sentimentalized version.
The second thing, and actually much more radical, was that he wanted me to rewrite some of the scenes of the War Cabinet meetings, showing ministers, to show them taking military decisions with the coming election in mind. In other words, they were saying, how will this go down with the voters? Now, that seemed to me absolute dynamite. And not only that, but defamatory.
Goodchild disputes that he made these requests. In an internal memo following the meeting, Goodchild says he asked that the political context of the play be explored. He wanted Curtis to produce independent evidence to what was or wasn't discussed during war cabinet meetings.
I wasn't asking him to change it. What I was asking him to do was to make sure that everything was clear and above board about what was there.
What followed was an exchange of letters which were interpreted in totally different ways.
He wrote to me the following day what he had not said to me at the meeting, and that is, these changes are mandatory. So that was really trying to bring very improper pressure to bear on me, I think, to insert things in the play and to change it in a way which he couldn't justify. He couldn't explain, he couldn't say where this evidence came from.
He wrote to me, we agreed I should look into certain things in the text when the producer, director and I get to that stage of things. They are in shorthand: consciousness of the political consequences of war, consciousness of a coming election, Galtieri's origins and rise to power, and more doubters should be heard. And now, that was his note to me. Now that's a perfectly fair, and it raises the questions about doubters. It raises the business about consciousness of the coming elections. Was something he was prepared to look into, right? Which he did, but he wasn't being forced, and that note doesn't say he's being forced either. For my part, I then wrote, we discussed certain points about the script which had to be addressed before we can go ahead with production. In particular, I expressed concern that we should put the largely military activities of our war cabinet into a more political context, a context reflecting such doubts, fears and opposition as there was. This was the main point. We discussed some aspects of characterization, but those will come up for discussion between yourself and the producer. Now, how do you get from that's a very fair record, and there are the two things together, his reaction and my reaction. How do you get to suddenly saying, you're telling me that such and such is mandatory and has to be complied with? It's a big jump.
The letter from Goodchild does state that certain points needed to be addressed before production could proceed. For Goodchild, this was normal practice in the reworking of a script. But for Curtis, who believed his play was already in production, it was highly suspicious. He wrote asking for clarification, but claims he was never given an answer.
I think the next stage was I rang Michael Grade and I rang Bill Cotton to say, can you cast any light on what's going on? Michael Grade did return my call very courteously, as he always does, and he did have some reservations about the play. The principal one which seemed to concern him was the sinking of the Belgrano, where he said it was not clear what happened, and in fact he seemed much to prefer the Tam Diel version.
The Labour MP Tam Diel had accused the Thatcher government of purposely sinking the Belgrano in order to scupper a Peruvian peace deal. But according to Grade, it wasn't a question of a preferred version.
I think he was entitled to take whatever point of view he wanted to, but I had a real concern that it wasn't clear from his writing what position he, as an author, took on the sinking of the Belgrano. I said, I don't care what the position is, but you need to make clear what you think happened, whatever point of view that is.
Grade and Goodchild claim the real problem was that Curtis resisted any reworking of his script.
I was working on a script with both producer and director, and we got on very well, and there were various things which were proposed, which were very good ideas, and I'm very happy to have incorporated them. But to come from Goodchild and, as it appears, Bill Cotton and Michael Grade, none of whom had written, directed, produced a play in their lives, that was a very different kettle of fish. One was on a different level altogether.
Ian's view was the script he delivered was commissioned by the Director General. Just go ahead, don't tell me to rewrite it, just go ahead. I'll make a few changes, but just go ahead and make it. You know, he thought he had a mandate from the Director General to make it, and it came as quite a surprise that we didn't share his enthusiasm for his work.
This difference of opinion about the play was not helped by the fact that it had been commissioned in the first place by the Director General, which wasn't normal practice.
Alistair should have talked to the head of drama rather than talking directly to Ian Curtis, and that was where it started to go wrong.
I don't think Director General should go around commissioning plays. I don't think it's happened before or probably since.
This split at the top would cause further difficulties later on. But in the meantime, a new issue emerged.
I began to think about the next general election, which was due in '87.
Alistair Milne then wrote to me and said that I'd like you to know that having discussed it with Bill Cotton and Michael Grade, I am going to postpone the production until after the election. It's too red hot, and it was the first time the question of the election had actually come up.
I would have thought that it was fairly obvious that in the run-up to an election, something which cast the leader of the Conservative Party in a pretty good light, really, could be inflammatory.
He was the Director General. He could write any letter he wanted, and that would have been the facts at the time as he saw it. But the problem was that Bill and I weren't party to that letter, and we were sticking to the honest position as far as we saw it, which was that the script wasn't good enough.
While this conflict between the Director General and his executives was going on, the only reason given to Curtis about why his play was being postponed was the upcoming election. But Curtis was becoming sceptical.
I was deeply unhappy. I could feel that the whole project was going to get the chop. And so I did a great deal of writing around, informing the governors, who were very shocked, really trying to bring pressure to bear on the decision makers to reconsider their decision. But after a while, I realized that the waters had closed over the head of the play.
Curtis believed that his play was being suppressed for political reasons and that the BBC was trying to kill it completely.
Anglia Television had asked to take the play and do it on ITV, and Michael Grade rang Lord Buxton at the highest level saying the play is not available, we're not going to release the rights. And if that's not gagging, I don't know what is.
There was a story in the press that Anglia Television, where Ian was very well connected, wanted to produce it, and the BBC had refused to release the contracted rights that it had licensed from Curtis. I had very good friends at Anglia at the highest level, and I rang them and asked them if it was true, because we would have no problem of passing the script on, what they call turnaround in the business, getting our money back from Anglia and let them produce it and let the world make its judgment. I had no problem with that at all. But I was absolutely categorically assured at the highest level at Anglia that they had no interest in it.
With his options now severely limited, Curtis decided to blow the whistle on the BBC. The timing couldn't have been worse for the corporation.
We'd had a pretty hectic summer. The government had attacked us over the American bombing of Libya, saying that we were biased against the Americans. We had put out 3 plays called The Monocle Mutineer, which the members of the Conservative Party thought were very left-wing, because they were anti-militarist. We had, ticking away in the background, a very difficult libel action brought against us by 2 Conservative MPs. So there was a lot of press flack anyway.
There was a concern entirely independent of the government and the politicians in the media, and not least in the Daily Mail, I think, as to the nature of public service broadcasting.
Curtis first gave his story to The Free Nation, a right-wing magazine. It wasn't long before the story was front-page news.
But when it went public in more detail than, in my experience, any similar row ever has.
The press were just going for the BBC in a way that, well, it certainly hasn't happened in, there have been occasional scandals and so on, but they were really going for the BBC.
The papers seized on what was being portrayed as a left-wing conspiracy, and a media feeding frenzy followed. For the Thatcher government, the row seemed to confirm their claims about bias at the BBC.
In trying to enforce changes in the script, just because it came out as being pro-Britain, pro-government and pro-the Prime Minister, these actions are quite disgraceful.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for what my honourable friend says. I'm sure that the people concerned will take very careful note of his comments in this House.
It touched a nerve in the national psyche, and it released people's anger against the BBC.
So it was a sort of wonderful example of what quite a lot of middle-class, conservative, small-c people think about the BBC. It bore out all their worst suspicions. You know, you write a play about the Falklands, it obviously supports Margaret Thatcher and thinks that what she did was a good thing and that she behaved well. And what happens? It gets banned. Typical pinko BBC. I think that's why, particularly somewhat right-wing newspapers, took it up with the enthusiasm they did.
And those papers had no problem getting Curtis's version of events.
Curtis himself wrote a very detailed account from his side, which was used a lot. By all of us, I think. I mean, that was what you carried around with you if you were covering the subject.
But on the other side of the argument, information was scarce.
The BBC's position was very much one of simply saying, no, we didn't do that. They couldn't actually prove it. They certainly couldn't prove what they thought or what their fears, their political fears, might have been.
I mean, the BBC, although it has a huge press office, lots of people in it, is an extremely difficult organisation to get anything out of if they don't want you to get it out. There was a deep suspicion that the BBC had a good reason why it didn't want to give a straight answer.
In fact, the BBC couldn't give a straight answer, as it had more than one.
Not until much later in the day did the BBC start leaking the idea that really the reason for this is it's just not very good. Now, it seems to me deeply unfortunate, to say the least, that just didn't happen at the beginning. If that was the truth, you'd expect to come out straight away.
I think that I made it very clear at the time to the Board of Governors, to the press, to anybody who was interested, that the sole grounds for not going ahead with the commission was the fact that I didn't think the script was good enough. The problem, the quality issue didn't come across as clearly as it should have done, was because Alistair chose to use the election as an excuse. Rather than say to Ian, sorry, it doesn't cut the mustard, old boy, we're not spending $1 million of the licence payers' money on this. Very disappointing, but there you go, that's life. He kind of fudged it, really, and once you start to fudge, we got ourselves into a hopeless public relations muddle.
Behind closed doors, BBC managers struggled with this PR mess, but the Director-General always intended to honour the official line.
Oh, I was going to strong-arm them after the election and have it made. I mean, I had decided to do that.
But before the election, in an ironic twist to the story, the main supporter of the pro-Thatcher play was sacked by the Thatcher-appointed governors.
The BBC's Director-General has resigned. Speculation is growing that he was asked to go.
The firing of Alistair Milne was an absolute shock to everybody inside and outside the BBC. It had clearly been plotted by a number of the governors.
The sacking of Milne signalled the end of the play. Without his support, there was unanimous agreement among BBC management that the play should now be scrapped for good. The fact that Curtis had gone to the press had been the final nail in the coffin.
Ian made it impossible, really, by choosing to go public, and it was impossible to operate in a normal professional basis with that the politics infected the project and destroyed it, really. And he was the one that introduced it, not us.
The moment it was blocked, I wrote to Bill Cotton and Michael Grade saying, OK, my play, I realise, is too much of a hot potato, so let us drop it, but please commission another writer to write another play putting the case for the defence. It is essential to the BBC's purpose that both sides of the case are put. They did not.
Following the press furore over the Falklands play, Curtis's career with the BBC took a severe knock.
It was my swan song, I think, of my career, because, as I say, broadcasting is a very small area indeed, and I was a difficult customer. Clearly, I was the whistleblower.
Curtis claims his income fell by 90%, and that his name became mud in the media world.
Oh, I think without any question I was blacklisted. I don't mean that there's an actual type list that goes around saying, this man is frightful, Ian Curtis, #1, enemy of the people, or anything like that. I just think it becomes known that you're troubled.
I never believe in blacklists. I think people who accuse the BBC of blacklisting them are people who've fallen out of favour because they haven't delivered. And if they choose to see it as being blacklisted, that's a sort of post-rationalisation. They perhaps would do better to confront their own shortcomings rather than see a conspiracy theory. You know, the idea that anybody's ever blacklisted at the BBC is absolute nonsense.
Roll tape. Action.
About 180 prisoners were taken, all of whom will be returned to Argentina. This action in no way...
Blacklist or not, it's taken 15 years for Curtis to persuade the BBC finally to produce his play. Even though it's being made on a quarter of the original budget, Curtis feels vindicated.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I wish to make a statement on the Falkland Islands.
I'm absolutely delighted that after 15 years it's finally seeing the light of day, and I hope those who've said fairly unpleasant things about it may be proved wrong, or may think again, maybe they made a mistake.
That is what the islanders have chosen, and that is what they shall have.
The original was 3 hours, and this current version is 2 hours, so I had to be fairly strong. And what I did was to cut out the entire Argentinian side of the story and the involvement of the Pope.
I will take this as far as Enoch Powell, although we will come back and do that bit again.
The thing which caused the furore at the time essentially was my presentation of Margaret Thatcher, and that is completely unchanged from how it was 15 years ago.
Opposition members laugh. They would have been the first to urge a meeting of the Security Council if we had not called one.
But while the play has now been made, the war over its original cancellation shows no sign of ending.
Everyone is right from their own point of view, and if it was a private company, Michael Great and Bill Cotton would be entirely justified. But it isn't a private company. They blocked the play. They didn't tell me why. They did not commission another play to put a similar viewpoint, a case for the defence.
There was no politics at the BBC. The BBC was not trying to change Ian Curtis's view of the world. It was not trying to change the script. We just wanted something that we felt was worth £1 million of the licence payers' money.
I do not need persuading now, and didn't need persuading then, that there were elements within the BBC who didn't want to broadcast anything that portrayed Margaret Thatcher in a good light.
I never heard anybody actually say, well, this is just a load of right-wing rubbish or whatever. That wasn't the way it was discussed. There was no conspiracy.
Yet 15 years on, the BBC still stands accused. The production of the play may be complete, but it seems the row behind it will never be resolved.
It was, from my point of view, impossible then, and is impossible now, to know quite what or who to believe.
It will be extremely interesting to see whether, in fact, most of us now think it is a good or a bad piece of work.
I still believe, from the moment I first saw it, that it was worth making. I look forward to seeing it very much.
I don't ever like to see any work buried. I shall watch it with interest.
I welcome it. Let's see what he wrote. Let's judge for ourselves.